Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. In this episode, we will explore the significance of academic freedom, the challenges it faces globally, and the ways in which researchers and academics can defend and promote this essential liberty. We'll also discuss the broader implications of restricting academic freedom on society and our understanding of various phenomena. My guest today is Julie Billaud, an associate professor of anthropology and sociology here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Julie is an anthropologist with a background in socio-legal studies. She is also the co-founder and one of the editors of Allegra Lab and is the co-convener of LAWNET, the Network for the Anthropology of Law, Rights, and Governance, and a member of the Working Group on Human Rights and Academic Freedom of the European Association of Social Anthropology. Julie, thank you very much for joining us once again on this series. My first question for you is, how would you define academic freedom, and why is it essential in today's world?
So thank you for having me, Dan. So what is academic freedom? So academic freedom is a foundational principle that allows scholars to pursue research and express ideas without facing restrictions or repercussions. The fact that we enjoy academic freedom, or we should enjoy academic freedom rather, is based on competency. It's based on expertise. So it's based on the idea that sciences should be at the service of the public good and not private interest.
Right.
Academics are searching for the truth, right? That's what we're supposed to be doing. And in this search for the truth, they rely on peer review. That is to say, on the careful evaluation of our work by peers. In other words, to produce knowledge, we rely on the discipline's authority and only on the discipline's authority.
Right.
And to a certain extent, disciplines are conservative. They tend to exclude forms of knowledge that do not conform to recognized standards. But professional standards are necessary to constrain the exercise of academic freedom. And yet, professional standards are always object of debates too, right? And that's how knowledge progresses. It's because these standards are constantly reviewed.
Right.
And this is what enables the emergence of new fields of studies, for instance, critical race theory or gender studies. These are fields of studies that have emerged because our standards have been revised over time. So academic liberties means that what counts as knowledge cannot be defined by governments or by politicians or economic actors. And therefore, academic freedom includes the principles of recruitment and governance by peers. And so in this sense, academic freedom is a professional freedom. Right?
Yeah.
I think it's important to highlight that. And so it's important in that context, in that professional context, that we are able to have tenure, right, as university professors, because it is what shields us from this external interference,
Definitely.
Right? So it's in that sense, I think academic freedom can be also distinguished from freedom of speech. While both freedom of speech and academic freedom, they include the right to say everything within the limits of the law. Academic freedom is the right to say everything, but not anything. Right?
Yeah.
So it's based, as I said earlier, the knowledge we produce is based on the search for the truth. And so on the rejection of bullshit, otherwise, to say things very bluntly. I think And so this is why academia, and in particular critical thinking, are the targets of authoritarian regimes that rely on bullshit a lot, as we've seen. So this is why the defense of academic freedom is a democratic issue. And that's why it's so important. I'm so glad I'm able to discuss that with you today.
Well, thank you very much for that overview. And so what are the main challenges to academic freedom in the world today?
So at the moment, academic freedom faces several significant challenges as a result of the rise of authoritarianism globally. A major issue is the increasing interference of politics in academic debates. So we've seen governments and political groups attempting to influence or suppress academic research, teaching, and speech that contradict their own ideologies and policies. So, of course, we've seen that in a spectacular way in the US, but we see that in many places where authoritarian governments are in power, but also, sadly, in countries where we don't have authoritarian governments yet, but we have authoritarian trends that are taking roots. So, for example, since October 7th in Europe, but also in the US, we've seen governments crack down on students and professors who use their knowledge of the situation in the Middle East or their colonial knowledge to express their solidarity with Palestine, for instance. We've witnessed arbitrary arrest and detentions, and more recently deportation and withdrawal of visas of foreign students in the US, of course, but in Germany also recently. And so that's a worrying trend. Another worrying trend is funding pressures. So research funding, as always, often comes from government or private donors who have their own agendas and therefore may want to influence university politics. Right. So another example that comes to my mind is the Hungarian government, for instance, who has restructured universities in the past years and their finances as well to appoint government-aligned chancellors who have significant influence over academic affairs, to the extent that in October 2023, a professor at Budapest Corvinus University was dismissed after a criticizing decision made by the university's leadership. But also the Hungarian government has revoked accreditation for all gender studies programs, effectively banning this field of study from being taught. Yes. Wow. But this move, of course, aligns with the government's broader conservative agenda and restricts academic inquiry in areas deemed politically sensitive. Right. So at the moment we discuss, we were talking about that before we started recording this podcast. We discussed the US, where similar trends are quite visible at the moment. But in many European countries, in Hungary, in Poland, in Germany, we're seeing these moves. The third challenge to academic freedom is, in many countries at the moment, governments using legal and bureaucratic means to criminalize or silence scholars and students whose opinion contradict their views. So an example, again, here is Germany. Sadly, Germany is often an example at the moment. But in Germany, recently, the parliament adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is the definition that is proposed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And this definition associates anti-Semitism with the criticism of Israel. And this has led to the severe repression of academics taking a stand against Israel's genocidal policies. For instance, anthropologist Ghassan Haj, who was a visiting professor at the Max Planck Institute of Social Anthropology in Halle in Germany in 2023, was abruptly fired as a result of the public expression of his views on Netanyahu's government action in Gaza. And so the irony here is that he's himself, a world-renowned scholar of racism. Right? But I could also mention other countries. In France, since October 7, authorities have launched hundreds of investigations into remarks about the Israel-Palestine conflict, accusing people of promoting terrorism. So they are using anti-terror law to police analysis produced by academics and scholars in general. So that's a very worrying trend. And the last challenge I see, which I think is the most pernicious and the most difficult to tackle and address, is self-censorship and depoliticization. So the increasing use of adjunct, right, and contingent faculties in universities who often lack job security can lead scholars to self-censoring for fear of not being tenured or of seeing their contract not being renewed, for example.
Yeah.
So many scholars are reluctant to speak out and self-censor in anticipation that their opinion may be sanctioned. But a trend that I think is even more pernicious than that, beyond self-censorship, is depoliticization, the depoliticization of universities. So you will tell me, well, no, I mean, how can you say that? We know universities are accused of being too politicized and it's seen as something negative. I would say no, actually, it's the contrary. What we've seen is that since the 1990s, neoliberal reforms in higher education have created prescribed paths for professional academics, and these paths move scholars further away from the fulfillment of their potential role as public intellectuals. Under the current pressure to count and measure professional performance, academics are less inclined to participate in public debates and activities that take them away from the rating path, and enter into public debate about matters that concern society, because, well, it's time consuming and basically it doesn't count, right, when you are assessed. So you will do things that count. And what counts is basically writing articles that are behind paywall and that no one can read except other academics who have an official affiliation. So that's for me another very worrying trend. And then finally, there is also this kind of hegemony of the positivist paradigm in the sciences that associates academics' intervention in public debates with a lack of epistemic objectivity. And this somehow challenges the credibility of scholars who actually intervene and take a stand, right? So these two patterns of, self-censorship and depoliticization, the most important threats to academic freedom at the moment. And that's the reason why we see universities, for instance, in Germany, where students are being arrested without any faculty member saying anything or taking a stand and trying to protect their students.
You referenced the US in your answer, so let's talk about that. So how have recent political changes in the US, such as policies introduced by Donald Trump, impacted academic freedom?
Yes, so when you look at it, the kind of measures that are being taken by the Trump administration are quite outrageous, right? I mean, I think the trends that we see elsewhere, they are more subtle. And, in the US, it's clear that the administration is boldly attacking and without trying to even hide what they're doing, right? And it's through what Judith Butler has called sadistic kind of means to achieve silencing. I think it's quite an appropriate term to talk about sadism in the current moment. So this has led to bans on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and discourses, as well as gender ideology, in all federally funded programs. This has led to arbitrary arrest and deportation of international students who engage in legitimate protest. And so what is ironic, I think, is while the liberties for which many minority groups have fought for decades are misrepresented under the guise of morally oppressive wokeism, we see an exuberant hate now parading as freedom. And that's really the irony, I find. But in addition to that, the administration has threatened to defund and has effectively defunded major universities such as Columbia universities in ways designed to intimidate others to agree with its position. It has reportedly even threatened adverse action if members of this institution talk to the press. So we see really a pattern of bullying. Nearly 300 students, according to the latest estimate I found, have had their visa revoked and could face deportation. Last month, Mahmoud Khalil, a recent Columbia University graduate who was involved in pro-Palestine activism, was arrested at his department and sent to Louisiana for a possible deportation, despite being a permanent resident. Shortly after, there was another student, a Turkish student, I think, Rumeysa Öztürk, who was at Tufts University and was arrested, almost kidnapped, right, by ICE people who were in civilian dress.
Right.
So kidnapped in the street and arrested, detained, and also threatened of deportation as a result of an essay she wrote in support of Palestine. So we are really dealing with almost gangsters' practices, right? Yeah. And that's very worrying. But what I would like to say is that these threats to academic freedom did not start with Trump.
Right, yeah.
The ground had been prepared by the previous administration, which sent the police to violently suppress students' encampments and did little to protect professors from being fired because of their opinion on Israel-Palestine. This has been going on for decades, actually. Broad and very vague charges of making students feel unsafe, for instance, have allowed universities to scrutinize everything a professor does, inside and outside of the classroom. We've seen right-wing groups who have instrumentalized anti-Semitism to demonize the Palestine solidarity movement. And these trends, again, are not new, but they have become more visible and systematic under the current administration. So now certain universities are resisting, right? So it's a case of Harvard, for instance. The dean of Harvard responded, publicly to the threats of the administration by saying that they would not implement these reforms. And I don't think it's because Harvard is a particularly progressive institution. It's not. But I think they've seen through the example of Columbia University that even if they implement these measures, they will have their funding cuts anyway and increasing taxes, as well to face. So whether you obey or you don't obey, it will not change anything. It will not make a difference. And so I think from that we can learn something. Mm-hmm. I think we can learn something for ourselves because our fears and our silence will not protect us. So I think we should be, as academics, we should be sticking to what we think is just and true.
And so related to that, and given the current climate and the challenges that you described, how can researchers and academics defend and promote academic freedom in the face of these increasing restrictions?
Yeah, so I think we need to raise awareness about the issue, and we need to educate the public about the importance of academic freedom and the threat it faces. For the past decades, governments, they have damaged the public image of universities, and they have demonized scholars. In France, for example, where I come from, since 2020, President Macron has blamed social scientists for things like ethnicizing the social question. Accusation of Islamo-gauchisme, also Islamo-leftism, right, have become a kind of rallying cry against universities in the discourse of several government ministers. In 2021, the Minister of Higher Education and Research, Frédérique Vidal, announced on CNews that she had asked the CNRS, so the National Center for Scientific Research, to carry out an investigation into Islamo-leftism in the universities. But before Macron's government, already President Sarkozy also discarded scholarly efforts to analyze the riots that took place in the banlieue, in the suburbs, as attempts to find excuse for what he said was inexcusable. So we see again, one government after the next rejecting the expertise and the analysis that social scientists are trying to provide. So I want to use this example because academic freedom is not only under threat again, only in the US, but also more generally globally. And if these threats, of course, quite spectacular in the US, I think they're quite also systematic elsewhere, even in countries that are supposed to still be democratic. So what can we do? Because I think that's an important question, right? What can we do? I think we should consider academic freedom not as a given, not as something we have that we can take for granted by virtue of being academics, right? I'm an academic and therefore I have to enjoy academic freedom. I have it. I don't think it's the right way to understand academic freedom. I think the right way to understand academic freedom is to see it as a practice. That is to say something that you practice in your everyday, in your classroom, with your students, with your colleagues, but also with society at large. You practice it. Academic freedom, to me, becomes real in the world. It becomes something that is, tangible when you're participating in it, when you're practicing it. That's why self-censorship is generally a bad strategy, in my view. Because once you bow to political pressure, academic freedom has already disappeared, right? So there was, my source of inspiration here, if you like, there are people like, for instance, scholar Iqbal Ahmed, who put it once like this. I quote him: "A good education should make manifest the organic, living links between abstract principles and individual and group behavior." So when you talk of democracy, you practice it. When you talk of freedom, you live it, because the function of good intellectual work is to apprehend reality in order to change it. End quote. So I think this is what an intellectual should be, and therefore to be able to have some kind of credibility when you intervene in public debate, you also need to have this kind of practice-oriented understanding of what is liberty, what is freedom, what is just, because you practice it. Yeah. So creating a culture of academic freedom, it requires that we collectively take responsibility for protecting our shared space. We need to work with our administrations to develop and enforce policies that protect academic freedom, such as tenure protections, transparent hiring and promotion, processes, clear guidelines for handling external interference. So what do we do when a professor is being attacked, for instance? Yeah. How is the institution going to protect you? Right? And that's a very important question because, I speak from experience here. Sometimes it's very hard. It's very harmful, the kind of response you receive, especially through social media. Yeah. And it's important to feel that you're part of an institution that supports you here, which I think is the case here. But also practicing academic freedom can also mean establishing watchdog groups, such as the Working Group on Human Rights and Academic Freedom at the European Association of Social Anthropology, to which I belong, which I think is a very important resource, because we collectively think about ways of protecting each other, but also systematically documenting violations of academic freedom. That's the first step. But it can also consist in partnering with other organizations like Scholars at Risk, for instance, to amplify advocacy efforts, gain access to resources and support, and share best practices. But most importantly, I think practicing academic freedom requires becoming attentive to the subtle and often invisible ways in which silencing occurs in the everyday as a result of lack of care or lack of attention, or through the policing of language, for instance, where you are told, well, we need to respect collegiality and academic etiquette, and therefore we should not maybe talk about that. It's going to upset some of our colleagues. Well, we should agree that we will upset people. When you're an intellectual, that's what you do. You sometimes offer, analysis that people don't like, but that's part of what it takes. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And my last question is more of a general one. So what impact can the restriction of academic freedom have on society in general and on the understanding of social and cultural phenomena?
Right. So academic freedom, I think, is important because it fosters critical thinking and the ability to question authority. and dominant narratives. Right? And you need to have in society this garde-fou, right? That's important. It's part of democratic life. If you no longer have people who offer different analyses, such as journalists, but also academics and so on, then you are in a society that is less democratic. So also restriction of academic freedom, I think, lead to a passive citizenry that is less able to engage in informed public debates and hold power into account. And that's dangerous, when people do not care anymore. And I think we are in a situation like that at the moment, where people are depoliticized, or on the contrary, their views are completely polarized, right? Because there's no space in the public debate for nuanced arguments. And that's very dangerous. But also, I think what restriction of academic freedoms does is that it tends to silence primarily, and maybe at first, the voices that are the most marginal already. Those that already are not very much heard become completely inaudible. And that's also very damaging for the plurality of views that you want to be represented in debates. I think over the past decade or so, the public debate has become completely polarized, and it has created huge divisions in society. And this is also leading to violence. When you don't have voices that can mediate, positions, then you are more likely to see violence, appearing in society. And that's very dangerous. I think also what these restrictions do is that they tend to erode public trust in academic institutions and the knowledge they produce. And so this also erode the role of academia in society. And so in summary, if you like, I think the restriction of academic freedom can have severe and very long-lasting impacts, undermining democratic values, stifling innovations, hindering the understanding of social and cultural phenomena. It's therefore essential to protect and promote academic freedom, to ensure that universities and research institutions can fulfill their vital role in society. And so I think that can only occur if we become collectively, and when I say we academics, but also society at large, we take collectively the responsibility to defend that right. That's also something that I try to discuss with my students, in the classroom, where sometimes they have very different ideas. And I think, teaching is the art of making it possible for a dialogue to emerge, right? And for people to see, for students to be able to articulate not black and white kind of ideas, but nuanced one based on the knowledge that they've gained through participating in events here, but also through reading, through the films they've watched, the exhibitions they've seen, the courses they've attended. And that's the role we should have, and it's an important one.
Well, Julie, thank you very much again for joining us on this episode of What Matters Today to talk about such an important topic. Thank you so much for having me. This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute Communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.